As Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, it's my privilege to welcome you to our Leadership Forum, Values, Religion, and Leadership, and to introduce this evening's speaker, Marian Wright Edelman. A graduate of Spelman College and Yale Law School, Mrs. Edelman began her career as the director of the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund in Jackson, Mississippi, where she was the first African-American woman admitted to the Mississippi State Bar. In 1973, Mrs. Edelman founded the Children's Defense Fund, and under her leadership, that organization has provided strong, effective national leadership on issues of children and families, particularly for those of the poor children and families. Mrs. Edelman's extraordinary accomplishments and contributions have been recognized by many numerous and well-deserved honorary degrees and awards, among those being the Albert Schweitzer Humanitarian Prize, the Heinz Award, and the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. Given all that she's done, it's remarkable that she's had time to write 5 books. Among those, a New York Times bestseller, The Measure of Our Success, and her most recent effort, Lanterns, a memoir of mentors. Mrs. Edelman has described America's overarching challenge as rebuilding a sense of community, hope, civility, caring, safety, and morality for all our children. In the preface to her latest book, Lanterns, she declares that I seek to reweave the fabric of frayed remnants of family, community, and spiritual values rent asunder in the cause of material pursuits. We must, in her words, build for ourselves a moral bearing and roots, and we must help this country recover its moral bearing and roots. Please join me in welcoming this evening's speaker, Marian Wright Edelman, to the University of Richmond.
Thank you. Thank you. Honored to be here with your dean and in this very beautiful campus. This is my first visit, and I hope it will be the beginning of others. And to be here in the room with so many of you who are doing so much for children, and to be able to say thank you. All of us pulling together. We're going to build that movement that all of our children need. I'm often asked why I do what I do, and I say I do what I do because of my faith and because of my family and because of the community mentors that I had, and I like to recall them. It never occurred to me, or in fact I never had a chance not to do what I do, because the message of service and the message that education was the means to an end, which was to leave the world better than you found it, was drummed in me from the beginning as being a dictate of faith and a dictate of a worthy life. Every Sunday morning, my parents, my sister, my 3 brothers and I gathered around the breakfast table. Each child had to recite a Bible verse, and we could get away with Jesus wept only once. After breakfast, we all brushed our teeth, combed our hair, checked each other out, and looked in the mirror, and then we went off with our parents to Shiloh Baptist Church, where Daddy was the pastor and Mama was the church organist and choir master and chief fundraiser. After church, before we could drive, we went with our parents as they took elderly or disabled parishioners home, and then we would come and prepare and eat dinner together. When we got older and got our driver's license, that was the chore of each child. Each Sunday afternoon, we would all have to go to the hospital and visit the sick and the elderly, and then go out in the community to see people from the congregation who couldn't get it into church. And I always had a sense that the church went out into the community if the community could not come to the church. And that is a message that I hope our religious congregations will re-establish. The church was the hub of my small town existence. And Brownie and Girl Scout meetings throughout the year were often held there or in the home of one of my public school teachers. And our public school teachers were often our Sunday school teachers, and there was this fabric of unified community that reinforced the values of caring. But in Girl Scout meetings, I pledged to do my very best for God and for country and for fellow human beings. And every summer, we went to Vacation Bible School, which was one of my favorite things. We had a week in the Baptist church, and then I got even to go over to a week in the Methodist church across the street. And in light of all of the changes that have occurred since then in families and in communities, and with our knowledge about the needs of so many young people who are unsupervised between 3 and 8 in the evenings, which is when an awful lot of our teen pregnancy and violence and drug use occurs, I propose that we call it not just Vacation Bible School, that we rename them and call them Freedom Schools. We've trained about 2,000 black college students and now white and Latino students at the Alex Haley Farm who have served over 13,000 children, and we love to keep those young people busy from 6 to 8 weeks in the summer. And in addition to teaching them values and providing role models, we also teach them how to love to learn and to read, and teach a reading-based curriculum with conflict resolution with parents coming in, because the gangs and the guns and the drug dealers are open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. How many hours a day are our institutions open in light of the reality that there are many single mothers, many teen mothers, many working parents, and children need to have supervised settings and positive alternatives to the streets. And that's one of the things that we're going to have to find a way to do. So I'm for 8 weeks Vacation Bible Schools or reading schools, but children don't need just Michael Jordan as a role model. They need somebody who grew up 3 blocks away from them, went on off to college, is coming back to serve and to reach back and teach them what they can be. And I hope all the young people here will begin to find ways of working with adults in your community to provide those kinds of service. We have one of the most well-educated senior citizen populations in the world, and I hope that somehow people with extra time, as they get a little older, will hook up with a lot of the young people to serve children. And that is something that I'm seeing happening in communities around the country, but it has to be increased thousands-fold so that our children have the protective coating that I had in that broad sense of community. The other highlight of the summer, we used to have revival meetings when great black preachers would visit and lift us beyond our daily small town routines and struggles. And the upshot was that the combination of tight family and tight community with the church as a hub, black children were wrapped up and rocked in a very secure cradle of faith and prayer and song and ritual, which is very important to children, and worship, which immunized our spirits against some of the meanness and unfairness inflicted on our young psyches by the outside world of racial segregation and discrimination and poverty that told us we weren't worth very much. But our parents said it wasn't so, our teachers and preachers said it wasn't so, so that this counter message enabled us not only to push out some of the destructive outside messages, and our kids get so many of them today with violence and materialism, but they also provided us with the spiritual anchors that allowed us to struggle against what we did not like in the outside world, and instilled in a lot of us a sense of outrage at injustice, which have become lifelong. Happily, these values of family and community in my small southern town were continued as I went off to Spelman, where we had morning chapel every morning at 8 o'clock. I was the world's biggest rebellion against compulsory chapel. But we all had to go because they would take away your quality points, which meant that your average would go down. And we also had prayer meetings on Wednesday and worship on Sunday at 3. And I also had the extra bonus of Morehouse College Vespers on Sunday morning, Sunday morning worship. And as a rebel, I said, boy, I want to see this all end. But after I got out, it was what I remembered most, because we had great leaders who came through and who reinforced the message of education being to help others and to serve. And when I became chair of the Spelman Board, I reinstituted compulsory chapel as my first act, because I worried that young people have so few times, not every morning, have so few times and opportunities to hear what adults think are important. And it is important that we communicate, however much change, that there are some enduring values and that there be informal ways of transmitting messages. And those messages of Dr. King and Dr. Mays and many of the great leaders of our time really did help mold me. This is about leadership and religion and values, and I guess the first thing I hope we will all do is to lead in our own families, because my parents were my most important mentors, and I feel so lucky because of them. I depict in my new book Howard Thurman's, the black theologian who was the dean of chapel at Boston University for a long time, but he told of watching the big old oak tree in his childhood yard that would have its leaves would turn yellow as fall and winter came, but would not fall off. Not wind, not snow, not sleet, not hail could knock those leaves off of this oak tree. Until spring came and the leaves would fall off naturally and become a part of the nourishment of the tree, but you would then see the little buds blooming. And he says he became aware of the function of the tree as protecting those young buds as they were growing, and then they would pass away as the growing edge emerged. Well, I think about my parents like I think about Dr. Thurman's oak tree. They hung on to us children until we could blossom on our own and always put our needs first. And so a lot of the values about family and about marriage and about service came first from my mother and father, and they are the most important mentors. It's the most important role in this country, and we probably do less preparation for that very important role than for almost any. But when I think of my family and my parents, I think of service, of bedrock faith, of unwavering commitment to community and to sacrifice, of sound choices. I remember my brother Harry coming home from Morehouse College for Christmas and really having a very heavy social schedule and being very upset that the car looked pretty run down. And he thought he would be embarrassed on his dates, and he had the nerve to bring this to my father's attention that perhaps it was time to get a new car. And he also, while he was at it, told Daddy his suit looked pretty thin and that his shoes could bear replacing. And my father kindly responded to him that my credit is very good and I could go and buy another car next week, and I could also get a new suit of clothes and a new pair of shoes. But I happen to have your tuition due in January, and I can't do both. And so over and over and over again, we were taught sound choices of focusing on the necessities before our desires were met. A book was always a more important purchase than a second pair of shoes. And the other messages that were transmitted was just how you hang in with family. And my daddy preached a lot about the importance of keeping stable families together for children and keeping children first in our minds. And when romance leaves, he says, you just settle for duty. And while I don't believe in abusive situations, I hope that we will all, as parents, if we decide to become parents, or as family members and aunts and uncles, understand the need of children for adults who hang in with them until those young buds can grow. My parents were also wonderful in that they never had different expectations for their girls and for their boys, and that partnership in marriage was one that I value and valued. And I think it was one of the important first things that made me understand that I could be anything, and that being a black girl in a small southern town was not a box that I should ever let define me, and that I should realize everything that was in me, and they goaded me. And I'm very grateful for those parents who, whenever they saw a need, they tried to respond in little ways. And my father's chief message in life was, if you see a need, you try to respond, and you'll never find a lack of work to do if you open your eyes and open your ears and just see all around you. You know, there was no black home for the aged. My mother and father began one in response to one man that I now know had Alzheimer's, and all of us had to cook and clean, and that's how we learned that everybody was our neighbor. When we couldn't play in the playground and swim in the swimming pool, my father and mother built a playground behind our church and started a little canteen so we would have a place to go. And I now think back, they even had the prescience to put lights in it so we could play at night and be off the street. And the adults in our lives kept us so busy that we didn't have time or place to get in trouble. There were all of these eyes everywhere, but Daddy's chief thing was, can't you find something constructive to do? And he would make sure that we were all kept busy. So great parents, but they were reinforced by wonderful community co-parents. And so the second way we all need to begin to lead, or to begin to provide a support for children, is to be a good neighbor, and to be a good member of an extended family if you don't have children of your own. And they're great. I used to love it when my mother and daddy left home, because I could get to stay with Miss Lucy or Miss Kate or Miss T, whom you will meet in the new book Lanterns. They were great community women who didn't have children of their own, but who took all children as their own. And taught by their example, sacrifice, caring, really believed in education for the next generation that they had been denied, and they knew instinctively what Walker Percy wrote, and that is that you can get all A's and still flunk life. When Miss Osceola McCarty died a few weeks ago, and when she'd given that $150,000 as a poor washerwoman to the University of Southern Mississippi to enable students to go and attend and get the education she hadn't gotten, a lot of people were very surprised, but I was not, even though Miss T and Miss Kate and Miss Lucy did not have that much money to give to any institution. They gave the day-to-day example of faith in action and of caring for young people, and we've got to be mindful of the messages that we send in our families to children as neighbors and as extended family members. If we are tolerant and we respect others, children will pick up those signals in their homes and in their congregations and their communities. And if we spend all of our money on ourselves and don't spend time or money on anybody else, then they will pick up those signals. And if we cut corners and lie, kids will do that too. So the natural mentors in children's lives are very important, and each of us leading in those ways collectively add up to what the community stands for. And as we as citizens act collectively on certain values based on what we practice, and I don't believe in this demarcation between personal and public, or one-day religion that somehow is not translated into what we do the rest of the week, because that's a part of the confusion that so many young people see today. Adult hypocrisy. They see us say one thing and they see us doing another thing in our homes, in our public life, in our private sector policies. We need to struggle to bring them together. But no parent raises a child alone, which is why they need the whole community. And I felt owned by the whole community and supported by the whole community. And then I went off to college and had wonderful mentors in key professors. Howard Zen, the wonderful historian. But then there was Dr. Mays, who was the president of Morehouse College, and happily there was Dr. King, because as a young person trying to find a way to break out of the confines of the segregated South, and having seen Mrs. Rosa Parks, an ordinary woman who became extraordinary, like many of the ordinary people in the 60s and the 70s who took extraordinary actions as citizens because they wanted children to have a better life, and because they wanted America to live up to its ideals, and because they took their faith seriously. And I love hearing them constantly say, if you really say you believe in God, why are you so scared to act tomorrow, to go out and try to register to vote? And so for them, there was no demarcation between their faith and their action. Their faith demanded action, and their action was sustained by their faith, which is where they got their extraordinary courage. And Dr. King was wonderful because he was an adult who was not afraid to say when he didn't know what to do next. And he taught the same lesson that parents and community had taught early on, is that you act by faith as well as by sight, and you take the first step and leave the results to God. And it was, again, wonderful to have that kind of public voice giving vent to the kinds of hopes and dreams of young people who then began to participate in the sit-in movement and had the courage, because of these spiritual anchors and the core adults who said this is the right thing to do. I feel very lucky. He used to come to class and spend a lot of time with young people, but he used to come to Spellman's Chapel a lot, and he would constantly say, as I told a few young people in class earlier today to us, about how important it is to keep moving, even when you're scared and even when you're discouraged. And he was often scared and very depressed. I remember him being more depressed than not. But he would say, you know, if you can't fly, drive. If you can't drive, run. If you can't run, walk. And if you can't walk, crawl. But keep moving. And so in the sea of apathy that one often sees in today's times, with people saying, I can't make a difference, you just have got to open your eyes and ears and figure out how you can do one small thing for somebody beyond yourself, or reach out to some child beyond your own. And that was the example of so many great women in my Mississippi years, only one of whom I want to talk about, maybe two, Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, because she was just a perfect personification of faith and action. Neither Miss Hamer nor Miss Maybertha Carter, who were my two favorite women from Sunflower County, Mississippi, where I used to be scared to death to go, and I would always leave before dusk. But they didn't ever try to leave. They tried to stay and to change, and they did it despite violence, and they did it despite losing jobs, and they did it despite enormous struggles on a day-to-day basis. But they did it out of their faith and their belief in children and children's need to have better opportunity. And I would like to just tell you a little bit about Mrs. Hamer and encourage you to read Kay Mills's wonderful biography of her. And there's another one out now on faith and civil rights by a man named Charles Marsh that has a chapter in Mrs. Hamer's theology, which I think is absolutely wonderful. She never went to divinity school, but she managed to bring a lot of stuff together in a very coherent life and witness for justice. But the first time she really engaged was when she was trying to register to vote. And she wanted to give hope, and she wanted to learn how to be a part of this country that she believed in very deeply. She didn't have a lot of education. She had a great voice, and she had great faith. And she never lost any opportunity, despite how hard it was, to try to transform those around her, because that, from her perspective, was what her faith dictated. And the first time she got arrested, she was put in jail in Winona, Mississippi. And it was very terrible. She got very badly beaten, and by straps and by inmates. And out of the beatings, she ended up with her kidneys permanently damaged, a blood clot over her left eye that threatened her vision, and she was thrown back after being whipped with a heavy belt, almost unable to move, into her jail cell, which the young people and others who were in the civil rights movement in Mississippi at that time called death cells, hurting all over. But she understood that there were some other young people in that jail, and somehow out of her pain she began to sing about Paul and Silas, who were bound in jail, "Let my people go." And there are records of Miss Hamer, and it's wonderful to experience her booming voice. She had no money for to go their bail, "Let my people go." Paul and Silas began to shout, "Let my people go." Jail door opened and they walked out, "Let my people go." And Mrs. Hamer's voice booming through that mean Winona jail gave little June Johnson, who was 15 years old and scared to death and who had also been threatened and beaten, and other young college students who were there, courage. And they began to sing with Mrs. Hamer. Mrs. Hamer, while she was in jail, reached out to the jailer's wife and quoted scripture to her about how God made all people of one blood, and she gently in court really tried to ask her persecutors and the prosecutors, how they were going to account for what they did when they met their Creator. She always spoke up for justice. I loved and respected her because she not only scolded and sought to redeem her white oppressors, but she absolutely scolded timid black leaders, and particularly black preachers, when she saw they were afraid to put their faith in action. And she would say, it's all too easy to say, sure, I'm a Christian, and to talk a big game, but if you're not putting that claim to the test where the rubber meets the road, then it's high time to stop talking about being a Christian. You can pray until you faint, but if you're not going to get up and do something, God is not going to put it in your lap. She chided the young students, black students in the community who did not want to integrate the freedom schools in Mississippi, saying you cannot reflect values that you're trying to change in your state. And she had a consistent ethic. And then she went to Atlantic City because she saw the importance of changing the political system as well as being there in organizing at a community level, and she was a key voice of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's challenge to the Jim Crow Democratic Party in Mississippi. And she generally did not understand that Hubert Humphrey would consider working out a political deal that would get him a vice presidential slot on the ticket of the Democratic Party at the sacrifice of 400,000 lives in Mississippi. But this was a woman who acted from faith, who acted on a day-to-day basis as a good mentor and role model and support for young people, but who saw the essential connection between faith and action and being a citizen who organized to bring about a just society. And one has to perform all of these roles if we are going to transform America. I hope those of you who are still in school or those of you who are out of school will think about being a teacher or think about working with children. You've got juvenile judges here tonight and child care workers and child welfare workers, and bless you and understand what an important role model and mentor you are, and this country has got to come to value your services far more, both in status and in pay. But I hope that we will all understand what a difference that we make. And I tell the story very often, one that I read, it was written by a woman named Elizabeth Ballard, about one school teacher and one student, because our nation and too many of our schools and our public schools and 90% of our children depend upon our public schools to learn how to be educated, to read and to write and to compute, and also what it means to be a citizen. Yet we often label and sort children by race and by gender and by income and by ability and by disability, and we have got to begin to understand the sacredness of each child. And I understand how hard the job of working with children often is without enough community support. But I want to just remind us by telling Teddy Stollart's story and Gene Thompson's story. On the first day of school, when the children gathered, Gene Thompson told all the kids in the class, "Boys and girls, I love you very much, and I love you all the same." But teachers sometimes don't tell the truth. They don't love all children the same. And Gene Thompson didn't like Teddy Stollart because he was a little boy who was very unattractive, came in class often dirty, hair wasn't combed, sometimes didn't pay attention, and even smelled. He was just thoroughly unattractive, and she really did not like him. But teachers have records, and it's important for teachers and child care workers and child welfare workers, in fact, to read the records of children when they're making the transitions, because these children shouldn't have to start all over at every stage of their lives. But she read the records, and in first grade they said, Teddy's a good boy, shows promise in his work and attitude, but he has a poor home situation. Second grade, Teddy's a good boy, does what he's told, but he's too serious. His mother's terminally ill. Third grade, Teddy's falling behind in his work, needs help. His mother died this year. His father shows no interest. Fourth grade, Teddy's in deep waters, is in need of psychiatric help. He is totally withdrawn. Christmas came, and all the children brought very nicely wrapped presents except Teddy's. His was in an old paper bag with a rubber band around it, and the children all began to laugh. Hearing that, Gene Thompson had the good sense to take the bag, remove the rubber band, and lift out what was an old rhinestone bracelet with most of the stones missing, and put it on her wrist and hold it up before the class and say, "Boys and girls, isn't this pretty?" And taking their cue from her, they stopped sniggling and nodded in agreement. She also found an almost empty bottle of perfume, and she took it out and put a little bit on her neck and said, "Doesn't it smell good?" At the end of the day, all the children gathered, left home, but Teddy remained in front of her desk and said, "Miss Thompson, all day long you smell just like my mother, and that's her bracelet, and it looks real pretty on you too." And when he left, Jean Thompson got down on her knees, and she'd realized what she had been doing, and she asked God to forgive her. And she committed to becoming a different kind of teacher, one who would reach out to all the children, and especially Teddy, and she did. And at the end of the year, Teddy had caught up with most of the class and even surpassed some. By the end of this, I don't know, it was 3 or 4 years later, she got a letter saying, "Dear Miss Thompson, I'm graduating from high school and wanted you to be the first to know. Love, Teddy." 4 years later, she got another letter saying, "Dear Miss Thompson, wanted you to be the first to know. The university hasn't been easy, but I liked it. Love, Teddy Stollard." And 4 years later, she got still another note in this story saying, "Dear Miss Thompson, as of today, I am Theodore J. Stollard, M.D. How about that? Wanted you to be the first to know. Going to be married in July, and I want you to come and sit where my mother would have sat, because you're the only family I have. Dad died last year." And she went and she sat where his mother should have sat, because she deserved to be there. She had become a good human being. There are millions of Teddy Stollards all over America, thousands in Richmond and in Virginia, whom we don't see or see only on the outside, don't respect, don't love, don't see the sacred spark that is there. Every single one of us can become a Jean Thompson, and every single one of us has got to become a Jean Thompson in one way or the other, in our spare time or in our serious time, because there is no more important mission than beginning to reach out and affirm children. It takes just one person to change a child's life and to ensure that children like Teddy are not left behind. Every year, in about a dozen cities at the Children's Defense Fund, we celebrate children who are beating the odds, 5 kids all over America in 12 cities. And most of our children are not killing anybody. They're not on drugs. They are struggling to stay in school. They're trying to raise younger sisters and brothers despite the drugs and despite the violence. And we need to affirm the strengths and build on the strengths. And it's always amazing to me when these children tell their extraordinary stories that I don't know how I would survive if I were put in their situations. It was always one person, a grandmother or an aunt or a counselor or a person who took that extra time to be there for them and to make them feel special and to see their struggles. So I hope that in trying to begin to make a difference, one will start in small personal ways, but then see how we can work together to change the odds that so many children have to beat. It is not right that so many children are struggling to grow up in America today, in the richest nation on earth, where we're number 1 in millionaires and billionaires, where we are the leading country in terms of gross domestic product, and yet we let our children be the poorest group of citizens. We are 18th in the world in the gap between rich and poor children. It is not right today, in this era of booming prosperity and state and federal budget surpluses and an $8.6 trillion economy, to let 13.5 million children live in poverty. A little over 2.5 million of them are living in extreme poverty in families with incomes below $6,400 a year. It's not right. How can God be pleased, or any of us be pleased, based on our professed ideals, with having children stand in food pantry lines, not have a place to eat and a place to sleep on a regular basis? We can do better than that. And I hope that we will ask ourselves, as we begin the new era, what kind of ancestors do we want to be? Why can't we find a way to share and make sure that our children have enough? I am so pleased that senior citizens have Social Security, but I think that children should have the same Social Security as they're growing up and will have a fair portion of what we're giving. This country is first in health technology, but we have 35 million Americans uninsured, and 11.3 of them are children. 90% of the children who don't have health insurance live in working families. And I want to just wrap back on the poverty and say 70% of the poor children in this country are living in families where somebody works. And our new, I hope, slogan for the last election year of this century will not be ending welfare as we know it, but ending poverty as we know it. Because if you work full time, you ought to be able to lift your children out of poverty. So I hope that that will be something that we come together with to prevent this kind of poverty in the richest nation on earth. One of my children has asthma, and when he had a serious asthma attack, I could always take him to our pediatrician, and I would take him off to the emergency room, but I was very moved when a Texas mother told about her 11-year-old daughter waking her up in the middle of the night, breathing, gasping for breath, saying she couldn't breathe and her inhaler was broken, and this mother rushing out into the middle of the night because her $8 an hour job did not provide health insurance, debating as to whether she was going to go try to find an all-night drugstore and get an over-the-counter remedy that she hoped would work, or take her child to the emergency room, which she knew would cost $100 and which she couldn't afford. You know, no parent should have to go through that kind of stress and decision-making in a country like this. And so I hope that we will all come together to say that the great power that we are is going to invest that power in seeing that every child gets a healthy start. And finally, I want to just say we've got to deal with the violence in our nation. We lead the world in military expenditures and military exports and in defense expenditures, and yet we're letting our children die from gunfire every 2 hours. We have lost over 80,000 children to guns since 1979. That's 25,000 more than we lost in American battle casualties during the whole Vietnam War. What is it going to take for us to say we want the killing of children to stop? What has happened to us? Where's the voice of faith and of outrage that says killing of children is wrong? I hope somehow we will begin to find our voices as citizens, as parents, as young people, and young people are not citizens in waiting. It was young people working with enough elders who transformed the country in the 60s. It was young people who helped raise voices against the Vietnam War. It was little children who walked through the mobs to desegregate schools and sat there day after day amidst heckling and others. And so young people have enormous power, and it needs to be harnessed and galvanized with caring adults. And I feel so lucky to have had the great adults during my era that was able to take the longings and hopes and dreams and aspirations of young people and transform it into a movement that in turn transformed America. The new movement that we must build for the new century and millennium is a movement to leave no child behind, to put the social and economic underpinnings beneath the political and civil rights, and people of faith and people who care deeply about the democratic traditions have got to be those who come and together to do this. Dr. King is not going to come back. Reinhold Niebuhr is not around. Rabbi Heschel was a great man, but we are all going to have to find our voice and bring it into the public arena so that we can begin to transform priorities in this nation and say to our children that you come first. The only thing America guarantees a child is a $10 or $15 or $20 or $30,000 institutional or prison cell if that child commits a crime or gets into trouble. That's wrong when we don't guarantee that child health care, a mother that has prenatal care because they've got health insurance, quality child care when that mother has to go out to work, or adequate parent supports and income support so that she has a choice or he has a choice to stay at home and take care of their child. We don't guarantee that child a high quality education to get ready to participate in our democracy. We tell that child he's got to have things and things and things to be successful, and then don't give him the job or her the job to buy those things legally. We have got to begin to come to our senses and reweave a sense of what's important, and that is giving our children a sense of purpose, and then enough to survive and enough education to have hope that they can be productive citizens. And that, I hope, is a task that we will take, because what will it do if we really are the remaining superpower in the world and we cannot care enough and come together to organize enough to give our own children hope? What message does that send? Let me end with a prayer for our individual and collective action, but we must act collectively to ask God to forgive our rich nation where small babies die of cold quite legally. Oh God, forgive our rich nation where small children suffer from hunger quite legally. Oh God, forgive our rich nation where toddlers and school children die from guns sold quite legally. Oh God, forgive our rich nation that lets children be the poorest group of citizens quite legally. God, forgive our rich nation that lets the rich continue to get more at the expense of the poor quite legally. Oh God, forgive our rich nation, which thinks security rests in missiles rather than in mothers, and in bombs rather than in babies. God, forgive our rich nation for not giving you sufficient thanks by giving to others their daily bread. Oh God, help us never to confuse what is quite legal with what is just and right in your sight. I hope that each of us will find ways in our personal, family, community, and public life as citizens of this great democracy to make sure that our nation does what is right and just for every one of God's children. Thank you very much, and I will answer questions. Thank you. I'm told that we have some time for questions, and if each of you would come to the microphone so that you can be heard and recorded, that would make your dean happy. Are there questions or comments? Yes, sir. Would you come up? Yes, ma'am. Come up to the microphone, please.
Greetings. Thank you for being here today. I've had the pleasure of marching with you in Washington for Stand for Children.
Thank you.
With the Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health, and we do a lot of work with you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. What I'd like to know, could we do that same kind of thing here with the support of your organization right here in Richmond? Unfortunately, those kind of things are always outside of Richmond. We have to travel to the district or what have you. Could we, as a local community, garner the support necessary and needed to stage that type of movement? I think the concern or the interest is here. That's my opinion, but I am moved by the fact that we need to be more proactively involved, as you just stated, right here in Richmond.
The answer is absolutely, and since 1996, when 250,000 people came together in just 4 months, we have been standing for children every year, but in states and localities. And in 1997, we at the national level built a national coalition for child health insurance, but there were 700 local stand for children in all 50 states for healthy children. That led to a $48 billion child health program called CHIP, which is now, we're spending a lot of time to implement it, but which will allow about 5 million children in working families to get health insurance. Now, we've got to get all of that 11.5 million, because I don't think God meant us to give every other child a healthy start in our wealthy nation. But standing together in local communities really was important. In 1998, there were a lot of Stand for Children for quality child care. In 1999, we continued to do local events, people learning how to mobilize, people locally focused. And in 2000, we're going to stand for children locally, but we're going to do it around an election year pledge. And I do hope that we will get our politicians to go beyond slogans at every level, and we're going to say what it means to leave no child behind and what we want them to commit to in terms of a healthy, head, fair, safe start. And so we should be in touch. My son runs Stand for Children. They're organizing locally out in Oregon and Tennessee and Maryland, but there are things that everybody can do in their local community. And the key is each of us beginning to get out of our own turfs and stop doing our own thing and come together in some unified way for children. And so if we can just, then I think that the getting everybody to focus on health, and then I think, you know, we're going to probably end up having to focus on violence, but if we could all come together around a big agenda, but say each year we're going to try to get one big thing done, and then to really train the leaders to implement it, because no policy is any better than the leaders who have to carry it out. And no policy is going to be well implemented for children unless there's an informed citizenry that monitors and holds local officials accountable. So yes, we can do that, and I'll love to sort of make sure you sign up afterwards so I can know how to send you follow-up information. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I'd like to follow up on your reference to ending welfare as we know it. In 1996, Dick Morris, in his accounts, recalls walking into the president and giving him polling information about what a passing or vetoing the welfare reform bill would mean. And he reports that Clinton got very angry, saying that the polls are biased. You're giving me biased results. You didn't ask the public if they want me to sign or veto a bill that would, let me quote here, sign a veto bill that would let 3-year-old children starve, go hungry in the streets because their mother was cut off. You didn't ask that, did you? You didn't want to know the answer to that. Did you ask if they wanted a father to wait his turn, who waited his turn, worked hard, was hit by a truck, and now I would cut off the benefits to his 6-month-old baby now that it can't work? You didn't ask that question either. So my question to you is, first of all, might things get that bad with the welfare reform provisions? And secondly, how do you feel now that the president didn't ask those questions of the public himself in 1996?
Well, I was very disappointed that he didn't ask that question of himself and of the public. And there were other polls, since I didn't buy Mr. Morris's book, I don't know which ones you're referring to, that showed, and where people went in to show him, that it would probably have been a wash. But it was a very disappointing action to see the safety net erode under the watch of a man who knows a lot about welfare reform, and indeed had done an awful lot when he was governor to bring it about. So it's been the greatest disappointment for me of his presidency, because I certainly didn't vote for him the first time to have him end up with the chance of making children, you know, poorer and suffering. Now, I would love to be absolutely wrong on everything about the consequences of this, but you know, it was good politics, not good policy, or good politics as it was perceived by Dick Morris and others, that resulted in what I view as an unjust act. And one of the reasons we went and followed up the first Stand for Children, because we wanted to show that there was support out there to do the right thing, with the second Stand for Children immediately on saying, okay, you want people to go to work, and you got to put something better in place, and that's why you got to really then make work pay. Let's focus on investing in jobs, in training, in health care for working people, in child care for working people, because as you know, at the time of the signing of this bill, it was also part of massive budget cuts that cut out basic supports for a number of people. And so the strategy now is to monitor what is happening, and I must say I don't like some of the trends that we're seeing, and the time limits haven't yet hit, and recession hasn't yet hit, and we've had all this prosperity, and people are boasting that the welfare rolls are down 60%, but you know, child poverty and family poverty is not down 60%, and 40% is a lot of folk not to know what is happening to. You know, we are worried about what is being reported from hunger groups like Second Harvest that says they're getting increased demands for services, for food, and that 1 in 5 in the food lines is a child. I'm concerned about the drop in food stamp participation and Medicaid participation, because state agencies are not telling people that they are still able to get these things if they work. And so we are really beginning already through our community monitoring project to see evidences of suffering and problems. And so I fear deeply what will happen to poor families and children if in this great time of prosperity, and many states have not spent their welfare money and invested it adequately in giving parents self-sufficiency tools, what will happen when we really do get on hard times and we have not provided help to people in terms of training and education and adequate jobs. And the bad news is that many of the people who are working are not able to lift their kids out of poverty. And poverty today is a working people's problem in large part. 70%, as I said earlier, of those who are poor and working families. We need to push this administration, the Congress, our governors, and others on why we're not investing more in making sure that parents are getting decent wages or getting the transportation and other help, the child care help. Why are they not spending all of their TANF monies? That's the acronym for the Welfare Reform Bill. Why they're not spending and breaking their necks to see that as many parents as can who are working get to know about the new health care. So we've got to talk about work and families and lifting working families out of poverty. And we've got to talk about the real help for those who have more serious domestic violence and mental health problems whom we haven't yet begun to see leave the rolls. And so the early signs, I think, a whole lot, the jury's out, but the early signs are disturbing to me. And so I do fear that in 3 or 5 years we can have very widespread suffering, but that's why we've got to get together and say, here are the building blocks we've got to put in place. You can't say that all poor mothers should go out to work and then not make sure that their children are taken care of. And last, we've just got to have a preventive agenda. The reason we came into business as a children's defense fund was to prevent welfare, to prevent violence by giving children that good start in life so that they wouldn't have to be dependent. And you can't not invest adequately on the front end and then say you're not going to support parents as they're struggling to work. So I hope that this will be centerfold of our political debate, because if we don't, I'm really very worried by the initial signs that we will have widespread suffering among children, too many of whom are already suffering. And I'm sorry that the President did not lead and provide the kind of moral example and say that's not the kind of country we are. Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Edelman,
Yes,
you
sir.
discussed how your parents in particular tried to communicate their values to you through action, through conversation, through discourse. What do you see as the challenges facing us now as we try to communicate with youth our values, our needs, their needs as well?
Well, I think probably, it wasn't easy being a parent back then either, because segregation and discrimination and violence were not wonderful, and inequalities made the public schools not wonderful, and so it was hard. But what we did not have was the level of violence that we have and glorify in this culture. We didn't have crack cocaine, as I remember, and we didn't have television that told us we had to have all these things in order to be somebody, and we didn't have this extraordinary reliance on external measures of success. And we had, as you heard me describe, stronger families and communities and the spiritual anchors, and somehow I think, we threw out our spiritual baby in the bathwater of American materialism, and we have got to figure out how to get some new bathwater here to re-immerse them in and to re-instill in them a sense that there's something more than a whole lot of things, and to relate new ways of relating to each other than by violence. We didn't have there's always been violence in America. We were founded on violence, but the availability of guns, 200 million guns in circulation, we import and produce a new gun every 8 seconds. I don't think that the Founding Fathers really envisaged having 5-year-olds or 10-year-olds or 11-year-olds coming to school with loaded guns or taking out their rage and alienation on other people. So I think that today, in the middle of so much violence that is so instilled in us through the cultural messages and through our children, that we've got to talk about how we provide counter-training and nonviolence and conflict resolution and peer resolution. We need to begin to say to them that there's a counter way. When the 10-Point Coalition leaders of faith came together because a kid came into a church in Boston and shot up the church, they went and got out on the streets and began to talk to the kids and to talk to the drug dealers and to work with the police and to work with the parole officers, the whole community, with young ministers who said if the church doesn't go out into the street's going to continue to come into the church, and if we are people of faith, then we've got to show that and demonstrate it to our children. And for 18 months, there was not a single child killed in Boston. It was hard, it was dangerous work, but preachers on the streets, working with others in the community, began to make kids say they care. And you'll see, unfortunately, good news often is not news, that there has been progress in a number of areas on violence and other things when communities and others decide to come together and to stop it. Gangs, if you give them some jobs and some consistent adult attention, begin to see that there maybe is another way. And so I think that it's just so important for parents to be parents, for adults to be adults, to not go to the lowest common denominator, to be honest, and more importantly, to just keep letting children know that they are loved. What is so important is that we convey to them that things like honesty and truth matter, that not relating in an intolerant or violent way matters, and so that each of us just has to take responsibility for conveying the best values about what it means to be a human being and what it means to respect other human beings and to make those children feel special and to instill a sense of faith or a sense of reverence for life if one is not religious, because people can have very good values and not be religious, and people can be very religious and not have very good values. So that, but I think that trying to teach respect and love is the key, and I constantly go back to the need to protect and respect and love and see the sacredness in every child, because you can have the best school building in the world and the most fancy, the lowest class size, but if children feel you don't expect them to learn and don't believe in them or really think that they are not special, then they're not going to learn. So it's really about ending adult hypocrisy and really trying to live what we preach. And it makes it harder, but the more violence there is, the more we need to be nonviolent. The more poverty there is, the more we need to share. And I don't know, because I think a lot of people in this country are now trying to come together in every community to say something's broken and we've got to fix it again. And we've just all got to kind of get together and let our kids know that enough of us are there. And for you young people, to be there and spend time with them and to be a good example and to give them the skills that they need and to go out there and use that vote that you got. Young people are not voting enough. Mothers and grandmothers are not voting enough. And I think if we vote for children and make our leaders say, is my vote going to make that 8-year-old's life better or not better, then we'll begin to see our children look up to us and see maybe somebody cares. But there are no easy answers. The key is to start with us, but then to make sure that we are trying to reach out and let kids know that they are valued in a range of institutions. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. You spoke earlier about political reform and welfare reform and investing in people. There's a disturbing debate going on in the state legislature here in Virginia about whether or not they should take welfare dollars and invest in education for people, in terms of not allowing people who are previously on welfare to use those funds to go to college. The basic premise is that you have to work to get off of welfare. And I wondered if in other states there has been a movement that will allow those dollars to be invested in education.
That's a very short-sighted position to take, because if we're trying to get parents to be self-sufficient, we should be encouraging them to get the education and training, and there are a few states that are doing that, and we'll be glad to share the specific ones with you, but there have been a number of states who are taking the same position as some folk are proposing to do here in Virginia. But if we are really wanting parents to support kids, then you really need to give them the training to enable them to do that in the long term. And we should stop playing a shell game with the poor, you know, taking from one set of needs for poor children to fulfill another set of needs for poor children. So I hope that you will resist that, and I'll be delighted to share with you the evidence from other states that are beginning to try to do that. But it's going to take a lot of organizing. Yes, sir.
I'm so glad you've come, because your presence is very inspiring to me.
Oh, thank you.
And your being here in person is especially important. I would sincerely like to hear you say more about family. You spoke on the importance of families sticking together and parents making the necessary sacrifices when things might not be working out to hold the family together because of the benefit to the children. Say more about what you think about divorce. Are there circumstances where that's necessary? Are broken families able still to instill the kinds of values and so forth that are important? Or must more sacrifices be made?
I don't want to be self-righteous, and families are come in all sizes, and there are a lot of single parents who do a very good job with their children. There are a lot of teen mothers who ended up, if they got adequate supports or had a good grandma around, who do a good job, and this is not about judging anybody. And it is also important to say that I do believe very strongly that if parents do break up or find they can't stay together for whatever reason, that both parents need to maintain support of that child, both financially and emotionally, because both brought that child into the world. And we should have adequate child support collection, but we should really make sure that both parents make sure that that child knows that that child is not the cause of that breakup. And we don't pay enough attention to the children's needs when parents run into difficulties. And I guess that my answer is that I do think that you hang in through thick and thin when you make a covenant. And I don't know anybody who wouldn't have loved to have left their spouse, and I'm sure that's sort of my husband, 100 times in the course of a marriage. And a lot of what you see is that marriage is about struggle and partnership and working out relationships. Most human relationships are difficult. But if you make a covenant, and for those of us who are people of faith, you try to hang in there. Now that I will never condone abuse or domestic violence, and I'm deeply disturbed about how often children are witnessing violence, and most violence occurs in the home, and so I'm not proposing, but the key thing is to really struggle to say what is best for my kid or my children, and to put those children's needs first. I also wish that there were a lot more preparation for marriage than we have in this country, because young people need to understand that this is not something that's a light thing. If you don't like it in 2 months, you don't like it in 2 years, you don't like it in 10 years, you just walk out, even if you've got kids. And so I would love to see a lot more stress both on parenting before we become parents, that most important function, and on the responsibilities of parenting, and on marriage before we get married. I mean, I was and to do more pre-counseling, and then to really make sure that when you cannot stay together, that the child still gets the supports that they need. Let the parents move, let the child stay in their home. But the child needs stability, and so, but I just find that the focus is often not on the child, but on the adult's individual needs, and so I hope we can have better balances and a lot more thought and care before we decide to marry and before we decide to break up that marriage, and understand that a marriage isn't just about two people, their children, and to take everything into account. But last, it's so important in this time when there's so much divorce and so much single parenthood and families that and out-of-wedlock births in many ways, again, to keep the focus on the child. If fathers, there's some wonderful work being done now on family ministries and youth ministries, because when fathers are taking their kids on Saturday morning and taking them off to McDonald's or Burger King, if there were youth and family ministries at the local congregations where you could bring your child as a single father or single mother and be part of community and get parenting skills and have a chance to work through some of the things that might have led to the instability in the family, it would make a difference. And so I think that we need to find ways in which our institutions can adjust to the changes in family lives until we can strengthen those family ties again. But last, you can't forget public policies, because when a parent doesn't have a job, it puts strains on the family. When a parent or parents cannot provide health insurance for their sick child, if they have a life-threatening cancer and have to go down the ward, as I've heard a recent story, begging for help to get every treatment of chemotherapy, that puts strains on the family. When parents don't have supports like child care or grandparents around and have to worry about whether that child is safe, that puts strains on a marriage. When the plant moves out of town without thinking about the impact on the local economy, that puts strains on the family. So that our public policies really have to make it easier rather than harder for parents to be the good parents that most of them want to do. Why are health clinics not open after 5 and on Saturday morning if you want parents to work? When are teacher conferences scheduled? What is the corporate policy on parental leave? And so all of these questions have to be asked over and over again. Are we making it easier or harder through our community and public policies and private sector policies for parents to raise children and to have stability, and to have enough to feed them, because that should be the first line of defense. And again, that's why I hope that we will debate what children and families need and how all of us, in a variety of our roles as congregations, as employers — it's not good when the employers drop health insurance for dependents — and when in our public policies, how can we come together to make it less likely that families will break up for economic and social reasons, and how can we create the kind of atmosphere through our culture where violence is not sold and consumerism is not sold that undermine parental values. So that's the debate I hope we can all have, but I hope that parents and all of us will think twice and thrice before we break up a family. Yes, sir. Who was next? I can't remember. All right. 2 more questions here, and then we will end.
Hello, I enjoyed speaking with you earlier this evening.
Thank you.
This summer in the Richmond community, there was started a coalition to create a living wage in Richmond, to pay employees of the city as well as employees of companies who subcontract with the city a living wage so that while working full-time, they'll be able to provide for their families. And this isn't the only movement for living wage. There's many, many across the country. And I was wondering what your opinion was of these movements in their efforts to do more than just raise the wages, but also to open a dialogue about economic sustainability in our communities.
I think it's a very healthy process and support it very strongly, though I'll be pretty happy if the first step we can do is just get a good minimum wage that's indexed for inflation, and we can get earned income tax expansions for working families, but I really do very much support the living wage campaign. And again, all of us should think what we could raise a child on. And so I am very pleased that more people are mobilizing and that the organizers are all getting together now and letting their turf lines fall down in order to begin to bring about, I think, a greater public debate and with some real wins around the country on the livable wage campaign. So I support them. Yes?
I have 2 comments that I would like you to respond to as if they were questions.
All right.
First of which, in the issues of adult hypocrisy, talking to a group of people whose homes, whose children, our homes are probably the ones who fund the good schools with $120,000 tax bases, and our money and our children probably have pretty good educations. In the midst of that, you talk to us about those schools and those children who do not have the good schools, do not have the good tax bases to fund them. That would be my first comment, and just the interest in that.
Put it into a question form. Make your comment and then ask the question.
Okay, and the second comment is that one of adults' problems that creates this adult hypocrisy is the fact that we do talk too much and that we don't end up listening to the children. And maybe a part of what you're saying of the children's needs is maybe that we allow their voices to grace our ears rather than us trying to work so hard to instill something in them. So those are just 2 subject matters that I think you might.
Well, let me just try to respond as best I can. I certainly think we should listen to our children, and we have an awful lot to learn from our children. And a chapter I had not intended to write in my new book, which came out, called Our Children as Mentors. And the example of resiliency that we can learn from our children. I'm amazed constantly at what they can take and abuse and neglect and somehow still manage to love and to get up over and over again. I love the wonder that so many children still are able to maintain despite all the clouds in their lives. And I admire what children did and the strengths that they exhibited in an era that helped transform this country. I mean, the idea of little Ruby Bridges walking through and praying for the white hecklers as she stayed in those schools in New Orleans, and looking at many of the young people who went through some of the school desegregation battles without bitterness. But again, they had strong adults constantly listening and hearing and having an outlet. And how I worry about all of those children who not only are victims of violence, but who witness violence day in and day out, lose a mother, father, aunt, or uncle, or a neighbor, and never have an outlet to talk about it. But somehow they keep at it, and so listening to children is very important. The Talmud says that someone says, a rabbi said that I have learned much from many of my teachers, but I have learned even more from my students. And children really do need to be heard and to be felt to be heard by the adults in their lives. And so I think we should all be greater listeners, because they do often bring a freshness, and they need to be seen. They don't need to be agreed with all the time. I mean, it is our job as adults to set limits. It is the job of young people to test those limits and to push them, but it is also because they want to know what we feel strongly about. And so adults are not, parents are not buddies. We should really try to be honest and to say when we're wrong, and to be mindful that our children are watching us, and to really let them understand that we are hearing them and want to hear them, and to communicate so that the rage doesn't build up inside. And so it's the openness and the listening is important. I think that the first comment goes to the question of why is it in anybody's self-interest to invest in people that you perceive don't pay taxes, when people do pay taxes, and why is it that we don't, in our public school system, have any school system of any diversity of size that educates all of its children, and the poorest children tend to get the poorest teachers and the poorest labs and the poorest library. But I guess the basic question is the self-interest of anybody. Well, why don't you frame the question so that I will ask it as a question? Good.
I guess what should our sacrifice be, since we are the ones that do have the money, since this school is training us to take positions with salaries many times the needed amount to support a child, how do you speak to us, considering it should be our responsibility to balance out some of the injustice that we've created?
Gosh, I'm glad you asked the question that way, because I heard it a little differently. It is everybody's responsibility to be fair. And all we're asking for children in our public policy and investments is fairness. I would like for child welfare to be as important as corporate welfare, and we subsidize the non-needy through our public policies. I would like for security in our own neighborhoods and schools, and education, which is the basic security, to be as important as the defense contractor's security. And we need to sort of have this debate. So we owe fairness. Those who have more powerful voices and more powerful means have an extra voice at the table and need to speak on their behalf. And we all need to take the message that we can take this education or these gifts, but use them in more affirmative ways to make sure that we are reaching and preparing folk to serve in the neediest places in the society. So that those of us who have education, as my old dean of students used to say over and over to me again, to those to whom much is given, much is expected. And I hope that that is going to be true when America's, who's got all these talents, is 10-talent nation that the creators provided us, and we're held to account. If we've only used 2 or 3 of those talents, I think that we may well be found unworthy. But I think that because we are extra privileged with education and with more money, bringing that to bear in the kinds of career choices that we make is really important, or with the kind of service choices we make, even as we may choose careers that are privileged, is important. And understanding again that it is all in our self-interest to begin to mobilize a citizen constituency to let America understand that every single one of us has a self-interest in seeing that every single child feels connected to community and feels valued. It cost us in fear. It cost a whole lot more to immunize them and have them born healthy than to put them in prison later on. Teenage pregnancy, drugs, or equal opportunity threats. Violence is everywhere, and you can't save your own children anymore unless you also work and save other people's children. I was so struck by a story I was told by a middle-class friend about one of his upper-middle-class friends in New York City who had 1 child and tried to do everything for that child and was a good father, put him in the best private schools, but was very concerned about the quality of life in New York and decided to move into the suburbs. And his fate would have it, that child ended up being killed in the crossfire violence. And the father was irreconcilable. He was inconsolable, excuse me. But and when his friends tried to say you did everything you could, you know, you took time, you put him in the best neighborhoods, and you put him in the best schools, the father said, no, I didn't, because I didn't pay enough attention to other people's children. And I think that one of the messages from the violence today is that other people's children and what they don't get, and from a lack of community, really ends up tearing all of us apart. You don't have to worry not just about the dangers of a gun in your own house, which is much more likely to be used to kill yourself or somebody in your household, and most gun violence occurs in the home, not in school. But you got to worry about where your kid plays next door. And so these threats have gotten to a point where it's just in all of our self-interest to figure out how we bring all of our resources to bear, and the privilege must begin to share leadership and voice with those who have been left behind. And every child, if we're going to have the kind of legacy that I hope we will have, is going to have to feel connected to something called democracy, to something called fairness, so that they will then respect others on their streets. How can we expect kids in homeless shelters who have no place to call home, no sense of privacy, and expect them to respect the privacy of other people's property? So I think that we're creating within ourselves the seeds of our own destruction, and unless we reach out to the millions of children in this very wealthy nation who see this profligate wealth and all of this talent and all of this education, but don't let them have a door in, our vision of a democracy is going to be hollow. And here we are, we're preparing young people to live in a world, we're not preparing young people to live in a world that is two-thirds non-poor, two-thirds poor, and two-thirds non-white. And if we can't find a way as the sole remaining superpower to show that a democratic, capitalistic nation can be democratic and fair to its own children of color and across income lines and across ideological lines, then I think that we will fail in this great experiment called America. So I hope that as we face a new century and millennium, that each of us will ask what we can add to make this place a place that is worthy of all we have been given, and to leave the earth with this period of leadership that we now have as the sole remaining superpower, and as we end the bloodiest century in history with a set of values that will be worthy of the next millennium. I do hope that Dr. King and not Joe Camel will be what we stand for in the new millennium. I do hope that fairness and nonviolence will be the symbols that we try to export in the world, and I do hope that all of us who have a lot will make sure that we share it with those left behind. And I want to make one final little pitch for an inclusive movement, and all of us really do have to come together, but I think it's going to take mothers and grandmothers leading this next movement, because we've got to go beyond where we are. And we've got to bring, I think, those kinds of values. I was very struck in rereading Gandhi last week, as he talked about women being more traditionally nonviolent, and the more nonviolent he became, the more he became like a woman. And I think that if we're going to transform the values of our nation, we're going to have to foster leadership at all levels, teach our young a different set of values. But I do hope that grandmothers and mothers with men and all folk will come together and say it's enough. We will not let our children be killed longer, and we will not let our children suffer longer. And so I look forward to working with everybody to build that movement, but it is time to say enough and to move to a different level. I've got some sign-up sheets if any of you come to the table, because if you're interested in joining our movement to try to leave no child behind, I hope you will get on our mailing list, and I hope you will be willing to put your faith in action a little bit beyond the comfort zone that some of us have been used to remaining in. But thank you very much.
to thank Ms. Edelman for sharing her passion and her wisdom with us this evening, and let you know that the table she referred to will be out in the lobby. Ms. Edelman has agreed to sign books, to continue the conversation with some of you. Let me also let you know that for some of your friends who couldn't be with us this evening, the entire evening will be broadcast on public radio November 2nd at 1 o'clock. And we hope we see you all back here when Bill Moyers will be with us on November 17th.
Wonderful.